So I've got three quick case studies to share, and you know, just I want to preface all of this with we're pretty, I've seen some pretty impressive presentations in this group, and we're probably more at the infancy stage of including this in how we think and work on projects. And so I just want to kind of give a flavor of how we use it to answer design questions on projects. So the first one is a spec office building that's actually currently under construction in Atlanta. And it's by no means a low carbon project. It's a lot of the decisions on the project were made, with as you would in a spec office building. It's a concrete, steel, and glass structure. We did do some research on how to lower the carbon footprint of the concrete, but that's not what this presentation is about. So it's in Atlanta. It's a warm, humid climate, and solar radiation is one major concern. We were kind of looking at developing these inside-outside spaces that people could inhabit, non-air conditioned spaces, along with, your traditional AC office spaces, trying to lower the operational carbon of the project as well. And so with that, we kind of spend a lot of time studying the facades, heat mapping on the facades, and then so that's the south and then north facade, and then figuring out ways in which we could reduce the solar radiation on each of these facades. And we developed this kind of louver system that went around that basically knocked off our peak solar radiation by, about 55% on some of the hotter facades. And then over the cooling period also knocked it down to 50 to 60%. So you're saving both energy, but also system sizes and thermal comfort and all of that. And then equally important, we actually did these studies to say, if we're putting all this glass for views, and then you have the shades down because you've got glare or heat gain, you're not getting the advantage of those views. So do these louvers help with that? And the answer is yes. On the west, south, and east, you go from like a 40% to 50% shade deployment probability down to 8%, where those interior blinds stay up most of the time. So you're getting the daylight benefit, you're getting the views, all of that. Otherwise, why put all that glass? And you can argue why put all that glass even otherwise, but again, not in the purview of this this particular discussion. And so really the idea was, can you put people up against the glass, make maximum use of your floor plate? And so on the right, when you arrest that solar heat gain at the facade, it results in a more comfortable, better energy performing situation. So and then what we did was we actually applied that louver skin as an exoskeleton, almost like a lantern skin outside the facade wherever we needed it. So on the north and certain portions of the east where we got self-shading, we actually took the louvers away. And then overall, what we did, or what we estimated, was there's about a 5% reduction in energy performance. There's a reduction in fans and cooling load, a little bit of increase in space heating because you're getting less solar heat gain in the wintertime. What we actually suspect is if you truly factor in the thermal comfort benefits, you're more likely to see an 8 to 10% reduction in energy use, because people are more likely to set their thermostats lower because of this, but we didn't factor that into this calculus over here. And that's kind of what it looks like. So it's a pretty integral part of the the architectural expression. So as we were going through this process, Tom Kundig, who's our design lead, asked the question, a very relevant question is, are they worth it from a carbon perspective? Are they saving enough energy to actually make it worth it for the additional embodied carbon that we put into it? So kind of scratched our heads a little bit and ran a tally analysis on the core and shell model that we were developing at the time. And that's kind of the results that, again, this was a very preliminary model, but this is kind of what we saw over here. So dominated by the concrete, as you would expect in a building of this type. And we looked at carbon cure, and I was actually surprised at that it actually didn't do as much as we thought it would. So we were actually looking at basically some other cement replacement strategies. That's the podium facade. That's your curtain wall. And that's the curtain wall with the glass and everything. And that's the addition of the louvers to the exterior of the curtain wall. Now, what's interesting is that blue bar over here, that's the energy use for 1 year in the building. And this is with the reduced, like about a 44 EUI. Your CBEX baseline is about a 96, right? And that's basically 8.7, almost 9 times the carbon footprint of the louvers. And what we had estimated was it would conservatively save us about 5% of our energy use. And that's the 5% energy use over there. So based on this, we estimated about 2.5 years was the payback for the louvers in terms of carbon offset. So looked pretty good to us, and for us it felt like it was a good reason to keep them in the project. What's interesting is, so this is a dashboard that we built in-house that kind of looks at operational versus embodied carbon, and you can kind of put in your if you've modeled it in Tally over there, and the operational carbon is based on eGrid data from 2018. And what's interesting, but you can override it if you have particular data from your utility. What's interesting is when you move from Washington to Georgia, your relative impact of the embodied carbon goes down, the operational carbon becomes much bigger. And that's because Georgia has a predominantly coal grid. So to us, the takeaway was the answer to this question is it depends on where in the country you're building it. It depends on what the condition of the grid that you're attaching this building to is. So that was kind of an interesting takeaway from this. So that's the first quick case study. And apologies if this is a little bit all over the place, so it's not as well done as Patrick's presentation. So the second one is a case study, which unfortunately I can't share any imagery of the actual project, but it's a single family home in the Seattle area that we're currently in construction documents on. And early on in the process, one of the goals for the project was to actually really pay attention to the embodied carbon of the project. The client wanted a net zero home, and then we talked to them about embodied carbon as well, and they were really interested in it. So, as with most of our projects, we have these assembly sheets with different wall assemblies. And what we started to do was to kind of look at the carbon impact of each of these. We actually start off with actually looking at a thermal profile for these. So we do a dew point analysis on each of these walls to understand, where's the dew point. So this is the red dashed line is the temperature profile, and then that indicates, your condensation point is somewhere within the assembly. But that's not what we're going to focus on here. What was interesting to us was in this one, we actually did a quick 100 square foot tally study where we basically used the design options kind of function within Revit and Tally to kind of look at well, what do each of these walls look like in terms of carbon footprint? And this was early on, I wasn't actually paying attention to the impacts of insulation. And so I just picked, what I thought was the lowest, and I was like, it's not going to make that much of a difference. So that's what you see over here. But what was interesting is it kind of allowed us to look at, obviously concrete is always a big ticket item. We do a lot of, steel clad buildings and things like that. That 14 gauge steel plate actually has a pretty significant carbon impact on the overall, project. And so, that kind of showed us, oh, that's actually pretty significant. So we started to pay more attention to the wood-sided walls on this one. Simultaneously with this, we were actually looking at rammed earth as a as kind of a low carbon alternative to concrete. And we were using cement stabilized rammed earth. And we were actually working with a particular manufacturer and installer. I won't name names. But what was kind of interesting was, so we actually, they gave us their kind of rammed earth recipe that we put in as a custom concrete mix into Tally. And full like disclosure, I probably got something, this is the first time I've done one of these, so I would love it if someone could check what I did at some point. But what this told us was, so on the left hand side of here, that's the rammed earth mix, and it's not without cement. I think it used about 7% or 8% cement in the mix. That's a concrete, the option in Tally with the less than 19% fly ash thing. What was interesting is when you go to the 50%, so 50% cement replacement within the concrete, you're actually lower than the rammed earth. And the reason for this is a couple. Well, firstly, you actually use some cement within the rammed earth assembly, but it's also a thicker assembly. So there's maybe less cement, but there's more of it. And so that was kind of a head scratcher for us. And since then, we've kind of moved away from that. We've actually moved towards low carbon concrete options as a better alternative. And we've actually been working with the GC on this, who's we really lucky to have a general contractor on this who's really gung-ho about this and really enthusiastic about finding low carbon options for things. So that was kind of it's been a fun process, kind of working with this guy on there, and who's kind of looking at that. The other thing that was interesting to me was, so we were focused on concrete all through this process, and then here's when I started to kind of pay attention to the choice options in the insulation within the building. So this is actually the base building with, regular concrete, and that's the spray foam over there. And this was with the 50% slag replacement within the concrete. So it took us down a fair amount. What we hadn't thought about at the start of the project was, what is all that spray foam doing for us? So when we went to the basically what is effectively the Demilock soy product with the HFO blowing agent. So switching the blowing agent on the spray foam, that actually had a bigger impact than all the work we did on the concrete in the project. So that was a big takeaway for me. It's like, okay, let's start paying attention to insulation, mainly spray foam and XPS on. And since then, we've actually started to really look at this across our office. To say, hey, let's actually pay attention to this. On this project, we've actually started to look at ways in which we could really move away from spray foam in some of the assemblies. It's meant kind of looking at thicker assemblies because the insulation moves to the outside. But it was kind of a good learning moment for us. So that was kind of this project. And the last one I kind of wanted to touch on. So this was one where we actually looked at, we did the embodied carbon analysis after the fact to kind of look at what was the actual carbon footprint of this project. So this is a children's museum in Berlin. It's actually built within an existing flower market. So the really cool concrete shell that you see over there is an existing flower market, and the children's museum is basically this. It was based on an ark, but kind of like the not the biblical ark, but this is like the Mesopotamian one, which is a circle. And so it's all made of timber within this existing thing. And part of the goal of this project was to be really low carbon. The part of the interpretive elements of this museum was teaching children about climate change and floods and things of that through flood myths, really. And so, it's all made of timber. And all of the exhibits, this is the really cool part, were made out of found objects. So, all the animals in there, all made from repurposed objects. That's a little basketball over there. This rhino is really cool. It's made from old fire hoses. And what's interesting is fire hoses you have to discard, I think, after 3 years. And they're really notoriously hard to recycle. And so this entire thing is made just from wrapped fire hose. The head of the elephant is made from repurposed VW wheel arches. So really, really creative. We worked with, so we have some really talented people in our office who conceptualized these and then worked with artists in Berlin to actually bring these to life. There's some acoustic ceiling tile, which I'll get into when we do the analysis, and some resilient flooring. So some challenges. So the construction documents was done by a team in Berlin. So we did the schematic in DD and then handed it over to the Berlin team. And so going back and kind of reviewing these documents to do the tally analysis was challenging, to say the least, because I don't speak German, and that's what the project folder looks like. And that's what the construction documents look like. So I had to literally spend hours and hours with my phone with Google Translate turned on and go over these construction documents to understand what was over there. So it took way, way longer than I would normally take on a tally analysis. And we did like 10 different iterations, because every time I'd noticed something that I hadn't noticed the last time around, including so some lessons learned. So this project is actually one of the few like naturally ventilated museums. So there's no cooling system. It relies on the thermal mass of the exterior shell of that concrete. But then in the wintertime, there's a radiant floor heating. And so there's a concrete subfloor that's poured to help the radiant flow, but also for the thermal mass in the summertime. And that was the first kind of lesson learned, was that concrete floor is actually 36 centimeters. So basically about 11 inches, almost a foot deep. So that's a lot of concrete. And so big footprint. And then the subfloor under the resilient flooring was I think it was an inch of screed, which is actually pretty high cement content. And that was one of the things that when we highlighted this afterwards, the design principal on that was like, oh, I wish we'd known, we could have probably made a better decision about that. So it's a good kind of lesson learned after the fact. And then the other thing, so this is where, we did all of this, and we actually published some of the numbers, and then it was pointed out to me that we had this entry vestibule that in Germany, because this is a Jewish museum, you actually have to have an entry vestibule that is lined with a foot thick concrete wall. Basically, it has to be blast proof. And so we didn't know about this till after we'd published the numbers. So we had to retract the numbers and republish them, because that actually took our carbon footprint up a fair amount. So just some lessons learned on the process. And the thing that I want to point out is, we actually broke it up by modules, because I think that's actually more informative. And so, initially, before we had factored in the screed and the blast proof wall, our module A numbers were in the minuses, which we were really excited about, but turns out it wasn't there anymore. And the other one was the acoustic ceiling tile. That's that finishes over there. That actually ended up being a fairly high carbon footprint. So that was the other one, was like, can we look for alternatives on future projects with that? So that's our cradle to gate numbers and the total in the tally report. What was interesting is, when we looked at, just the module A numbers compared to what a normal, building of this type would be, we were about 90% below. And if you looked at the total versus that number, we were probably at about 80 to 85%. So, yes, it wasn't zero carbon, but still pretty low carbon. We were pretty excited about the reduction. And the big lesson there is if you can reuse an existing building, those numbers start to look really good. And then I just kind of wanted to, end with this, just because this is something that I'm still struggling with. We do these analysis to look at embodied carbon and then operational, and then the embodied is more critical because it's, it's immediate, right? This is what we see. But then we look at, the totals in tally. And really, if we're looking at it that way and we're looking at the immediacy of stuff, and this is where that question about, what is the end of life? We should really be separating these out and kind of, that's really what that life cycle looks like. All of this stuff doesn't happen at the beginning. It happens as you go along. So, so think about both operational and, think about these things as almost quasi-operational carbon. It's really important. And then, think about how can we prolong that end of life so we can actually figure out how to repurpose these things. I actually work in a 130-year-old building that's timber. So, timber doesn't necessarily have to have a 30-year lifespan. It can be a very, very, long-lived material depending on how you deal with it. So, so I just want to kind of put that out there. And, apologies for being all over the place, but this is really just how we work. It's like, it's messy because it's process. It's not, and we're still learning. So, yeah, I'd love to get some feedback and, how we can do this better. Thanks.
That's beautiful stuff. Just on that last note, 100-year timber building, I'm in a similar building down in Pioneer Square.
Yeah.
Not far from where you are, and it makes total sense.
Yeah, we have so many examples of those, right?
Vikram, on your first study, with a clean grid, did those louvers are they still justified by the balance of operational?
That was kind of the intent of that last slide. So here, let me just share that again. Not as much. So I think, depending on your grid. So, so this is actually, oops. This is actually looking at it in Washington's grid. It probably, if you use the average for Washington, it probably still, maybe it's probably more like a 12 or 13-year payback, which to me still makes sense. But, if you use Seattle's grid, obviously it's never going to make sense because we're pretty much, carbon free. So it really does depend from a purely operational carbon standpoint. But for most of the country, what we sometimes tend to forget, because we live in the part of the country that's got the cleanest grid, this whole part of the country is still, pretty dirty. If you go one state over to Montana, it's like, it's a very dirty grid. And, I lived in Georgia for like, 11 years. And I was actually the chair of the Georgia Solar Energy Association, and, worked with Southern Company trying to, get them. And they're a long way from getting there. So, I think it really does depend on where you plug your building in. And that's actually the fun thing with this, the dashboard tool that we created, that was a screenshot of, is it kind of allows you to, just move your building around and see what the impact is, right?
Vikram, since we don't seem to be getting any questions right now, hate to throw you on the spot, but would you be willing to just kind of give a sneak preview of that tool?
Sure. You know, I might be cursed with the curse of the live demo.
Yeah.
Where, oh God, I remember years ago doing a live demo of a Excel-based dashboard at a conference in Quebec, and all the Excel things were in French, so I couldn't figure out how to run it. Okay, so this is kind of the main board of the kind of tool, and behind the scenes, what we have here is you have basically, if you have an eQUEST baseline model, you paste your results in over there, and what that does is it kind of gives you what your code compliant building does. And what's useful is to actually see how it uses energy. So it's not just, you know, a gray bar, it's actually lights, you know, equipment, heating, cooling, you know, so you can make actionable decisions. And over here, so you have your embodied carbon thing, which is really should be modulated in something over there. And then you've got your lifespan of the building, and you can set it to say, you know, okay, I want to look at this over, let's say 60 years rather than 20. What does that look like? And so that's your baseline building, and that's your design building over there. So your total tons. And I can say, okay, you know, so these numbers are from the construction carbon calculator. You know, that's what the wood option in that website gives you versus steel, but I can override it if I've modeled, you know, let's say I've modeled it and I know it's, you know, 40,000 tons. Or maybe that's too much, I don't know. I can override that, you know, with actual data. I can override my operational carbon if I have actual grid information. But what's nice is I can kind of test my grid, go one state over, go, you know, if I go to Montana, wow, that thing starts to go off your embodied carbon over there. But then I can go over here. So let's go back to Georgia and start to say, okay, you know, let me try to set some targets to say I want to reduce my lighting load by 50%. You can see as I turn this over, it changes color and changes instructions. So if I go pretty aggressive, it says, you know, you really need to start to target, you know, spatial daylight autonomy over 70%, use LEDs, use vacancy sensors, all of these other things, you know, on the heating side. And then if you go too far, it kind of puts up a red flag that says, you know, this is exceedingly difficult target to hit. Maybe it's not feasible. So allows me to, and it's moving my design thing over there. So, you know, if I get that, you know, down far enough, let's say, I don't know, I'm just making stuff up at this point. Let's say I get my, you know, do some crazy stuff and get my energy use down to 22, I can start to put some photovoltaics on the roof. And the idea is to get the PV number up high enough to match that. And that tells me, you know, based on this square footage in a 2-storied building, which this wasn't, what percentage of roof area do I need to cover with PV to get there? And it's really a rough rule of thumb thing. And then, you know, let's say this was a smaller building. So let's say it was a 10,000 square foot office building. I can start to play around with, you know, how many trees do I need to really plant to offset that that embodied carbon footprint. And that's based off of a study we found from EPA looking at, you know, by year, the carbon sequestered in a tree. Obviously, as you get, you know, older, it sequesters more carbon. So, you know, again, this was a very, very quick and dirty way to look at this. But what was interesting to us was, it takes a lot of trees to it's not, especially if you look at it over a smaller time span, that those, 300 trees over 30 years is actually not doing that much. It's really, so, to say I'm immediately offsetting my carbon footprint is not necessarily correct. So, which is why it makes a lot of sense to focus on this embodied carbon bit. So that's kind of like this dashboard tool that we've started to use. And the goal is to actually, at the start of each project, to kind of get this roadmap, whether they actually follow it, as we go through, we see, but it's like, here's how you get to net zero. Here's all the things you should be targeting for this project. And here's some design suggestions to get there.